Acadia Pharmaceuticals. We're focused on developing and commercializing novel treatments for CNS disorders. As Charles mentioned, we have 2 commercial stage assets in our portfolio today, and then a pipeline behind that. I can give some highlights on each of those. Nuplazid, which is the first and still only approved treatment for Parkinson's disease psychosis. I think at this point, we look at this as the financial foundation of the company. We have well over $500 million in sales, and this asset is throwing off more than $300 million in free cash flow. Our commercial initiatives really this year have been focused on disseminating 3 real-world evidence studies that were published last year that are resonating both with HCPs in the office-based setting as well as the long-term care setting, which are 2 primary channels. And we can talk about that in Q&A as we get there. The second asset, commercial stage asset, we launched earlier this year for Rett syndrome. We're very excited about the launch. Continues to go exactly as planned and exceeding expectations. In the first quarter on market, so about 5/5 of a quarter, the second fiscal quarter, we were generating sales. We posted $23.2 million of sales, and we've guided to $45 to $55 million of sales for the upcoming third quarter. I think more importantly than financials is that we're very pleased and excited to hear preliminary feedback from caregivers who are treating their loved ones that are suffering from this unfortunate disease, and really hearing early signs of efficacy and improvements in these patients, which is very encouraging in an early stage of launch. Our late stage pipeline has 3 assets. Pimavanserin, which is the active ingredient in Nuplazid, we've been studying for negative symptoms of schizophrenia. We have 1 positive pivotal study in this patient population, which is unusual because it's been a difficult patient population to study. For our second pivotal study, we completed enrollment this past summer and expect top-line readout in the first quarter of next year. If positive, we should have sufficient data to file for an sNDA with the FDA for a label expansion in negative symptoms in schizophrenia. Then also, before the end of this year, we expect to start 2 additional late-stage trials with 2 different assets, ACP-101 for the treatment of Prader-Willi syndrome. We'll be starting a phase 3 trial later this year. And then our next generation 5-HT2A compound, ACP-204, will be starting a phase 2 trial in Alzheimer's disease psychosis. And considering we know this space very well with our all the work we've done developmentally and commercially for Nuplazid, this can be an accelerated development plan that, if continues to be successful, the phase 2 sites can seamlessly enroll patients into phase 3, which could save us about a year in the overall development timeline. In addition to that, I guess the other thing we did this summer is we expanded our rights to trofinetide, which is the active ingredient in Daybue. Initially, we had licensed the product from our partner, a public company called Neuren Pharmaceuticals, that's based in Australia. Originally, we had North American rights. This summer, we expanded our rights worldwide to bridge upon the success that we've had in our early stage of launch, and we're very excited to bring trofinetide, see what the brand name will be, Daybue or otherwise, to patients worldwide. And then in addition to kind of the late stage pipeline and commercial stage assets, we have a portfolio of disclosed and undisclosed products in our early stage pipeline, and we continue to be very active on the business development front to continue to expand the portfolio. So that's the brief snapshot. Charles, we'll turn it back to you.
That was a nice overview. We're going to dive into some questions to unpack that. I appreciate you sharing that with us, Mark. Why don't we go back to the Pima franchise? Not the main focus of most investors right now, but I wanted to ask you a question about that, because you mentioned that it is a $500 million revenue generator.
Right, more than that.
More than that. Spinning off $300 in cash. That's pretty astonishing profitability that I think hasn't really been appreciated by investors. How do you do that, and where do you see the growth coming from for Pima?
So I think where we are, thanks for that. I think Nuplazid is 7 years into its commercial life, right? And so when you launch a product, as we're doing with Daybue today, you really focus on establishing a brand, making sure you can reach as many patients as possible to really position yourself for future and long-term growth to maximize the value of the franchise. And so the investment is today and to building the future. When you get into kind of the midlife cycle of an asset, you're really looking at both top-line growth and current year profitability. And that's how we've looked at Nuplazid in the environment that is in today, including the fact that we just lived through a couple of years of a global pandemic, and unfortunately this is an elderly and frail patient population. And so there was mortality in this patient population, as you'd expect. So there was some reduction in patients, and that also influences kind of our investment decision. So we're not dogmatic about it. We're looking to say, all right, how do we continue to maximize the value of the franchise, and what's the right level of spend in light of where we are in the market opportunity that we face, as well as the life cycle of the asset. And so what we have done, at least on the cost side, as we've transitioned more to this focus on near-term profitability, we've taken out what we expect to spend this year will be more than $100 million, or about $100 million less than we spent 2 years ago supporting the brand. Okay. But you're still focused on top line. So your current year profitability comes from both driving top line as well as being efficient on your spend base. And so on the top line, what the current focus is on is what I mentioned in the opening remarks, right? The dissemination of the real-world evidence studies, 2 of which showed a reduced mortality when using pimavanserin as compared to off-label antipsychotics in this patient population, and the third showing lower healthcare utilization, hospitalizations, emergency room visits, et cetera, for patients that are on pimavanserin versus off-label antipsychotics. And those studies have resonated with our customer base. Particularly the third one with the long-term care channel, which you may want to get there. So I think so our commercial efforts are focused on giving healthcare professionals the best information that we can give them to date to make the right choices for prescriptions for their patients, and then we benefit from we've been benefiting from a higher rate of new patient starts, which is leading to some modest volume growth in the franchise this year. And we'll continue to have this as our focus of kind of both top-line growth, but also near-term profitability.
So it sounds like the real-world evidence is particularly useful to the long-term care channel, and that there are some synergies in your efforts to market to that. Yet you've done something, I mean, you mentioned these last 3 years have been very challenging for a lot of people, particularly elderly people, and for the Parkinson's patient population. You've grown the drug in spite of, many drugs in the class, not the class, but used in Parkinson's, having not grown. So that's pretty interesting.
I mean, we've been very proud of our efforts. I think when you look at kind of baseline Parkinson's medicines like carbidopa or levodopa, those are not medicines that patients come off of. Yeah. And the volume of scripts in that market has essentially been flat, and it should have grown in a normal normal growth of patient, non-COVID patient environment. So we've certainly outpaced that. So what we can continue to do is recognize the environment that we're in, make the right investments to help our patients and grow our business, but be mindful that again, there has been some reduction in patient population, and as I mentioned earlier, we're in the mid stage of the asset. So at some point, you change your focus to the near term versus the long term.
Yeah. So let's move on to DAYBUE or trofinetide, and then we'll get into the pipeline. So quickly, just any questions on pimavanserin for PDP before I move forward? If you do have something, just yell at me and I'll get you. So let's talk about DAYBUE. Pretty impressive launch. I was surprised, big time surprised at the adoption, understanding the unmet need, understanding the first ever drug. But I was surprised that you gave guidance. And so what is the basis? What's the confidence in giving guidance just 2 quarters into the launch?
Right. And so, well, I think there's 2 ways that I guess we can approach to this. We can give a bunch of KPI data to the market so investors can try to piece together the picture themselves, or you can provide guidance and essentially provide the output versus the input.
Makes it easier for us.
And for us, when this is a new launch, there are a lot of variables. This is a weight-based dosing product. Patients are titrating. Right. We don't know what the ultimate compliance level to dose, what's the level of persistency, continuation versus discontinuation. And only 1 quarter in, there are wide error bars on that. And if you take it to the extremes, you can wind up with answers that are not particularly helpful to anybody. But there are things we know. There's things that are still open to us, right? I mean, we only launched in April. So it's not that people have been on therapy for a year yet, at least the naive patients aren't. It's only a number of months. So we thought it'd be most helpful to provide a reasonable range of guidance, only 1 quarter out. So I think for those of you that don't know our story, we gave guidance for the 3rd quarter of this year, not the full year, not a peak sales guidance. And so what we'll continue to do as we report quarters is to give quarter forward guidance until such time that we just give annual guidance, and expect to give annual guidance sometime during next year. So maybe it's quarter or so in, we give remainder of the year guidance. We'll see as the information plays out to us. And we'll continue to share, qualitative and quantitative information as we report out financial results to really give the right picture and understanding of our launch and our financial performance.
Well, the guidance certainly helps, but there were three key components of, call it the revenue stream out of DAYBUE that you mentioned. One is weight-based dosing, which is a function of age in part. And the second is titration, and the third is persistence. So why don't we talk a little bit qualitatively about what your assumptions are or what you're seeing? With regard to weight-based dosing, are you...
And there's one other element to that, is ultimate compliance to dose.
Sure.
So while there is a recommended dose in the label, our expectation is not all patients will get up to that full recommended dose. So how are they at the full recommended or something less than that? And that obviously factors into their product utilization and our ultimate revenues.
A key consideration, compliance and persistence, is not only perceived efficacy, but perceived tolerability or clinical benefit. So why don't we talk about, first of all, with regard to weight-based dosing or age, in general, are you treating the earlier patients or are you treating the much later patients? Because with Rett patients, they can be quite young and then they can live a long time and become larger and older and larger.
So commercially, the patient demographics that we're treating is largely aligns with the patient population. So our label's broad, right? It's anyone who has diagnosed with Rett syndrome ages 2 and above. And the patient population that we're treating largely aligns with that. Maybe in the early days, it's maybe skews a little younger because if you're a caregiver of a young patient, you might be more incentivized or at least motivated to seek treatment than if you have an adult loved one that you're treating, or maybe it's parents that are no longer around, so they're actually not being treated by loved ones. So there's a little of that, but I would say predominantly the patient population that we're treating largely reflects the demographics of the Rett population.
And titration. Go ahead.
Well, just shut me down if you want to stick to the commercial stuff, but that makes sense. Makes a lot of sense given what we know about the biology of the disease. Because it's important to understand that Rett's is a neurodevelopmental disorder, not a neurodegenerative disorder. So essentially, the pathophysiology of the disease affects the structure and function of neurons, but they don't degenerate and they don't die. So theoretically, and with the understanding we have about the biology of trofinetide and how it in animal models improves structure and function and communication between neurons, you could see improvements theoretically at any age, and that's what we're seeing. And so that's what we saw in the trial. We saw consistent improvements across different age groups, and then what we're seeing in the market is clinicians aren't focusing on a particular age group. We're seeing them evaluating patients of all different ages as to the potential benefits that they might gain.
So Doug, you're seeing efficacy despite polypharmacy and a patient having endured the disease for a long time? Yeah,
I mean, polypharmacy, there's nothing else approved for Rett's, obviously, but they're on a number of different medications for pain and for the other disabilities that they suffer as a result of the syndrome. But they're also receiving these patients get a lot of speech therapy, physical therapy, and as far as we understand, being treated with trofinetide would kind of facilitate those therapies.
Okay. And what about the safety side? There was much made or discussed about some of the safety challenges of Rett generally, but of this particular therapy. I know it's too early to be able to speak rigorously about persistence, but, oops, sorry, someone's calling me. Sorry about that.
Thanks for not taking it.
Another important company I'm talking about now. So
no, it was Al. He didn't like the question.
Yeah, Al just joined this company, and it's great to see him here. So talk to us about persistence. Probably too early to say, but are patients
Well, I think maybe Doug could talk about not safety, but the tolerability, right? Because that leads into persistency and what we're seeing from patients that are on therapy today.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you used the term safety. We've never seen a safety issue with trofinetide.
Understood.
But I think what you're talking about mostly is the diarrhea, which in the trials was certainly a tolerability issue. And the dropout in the trials was, in the 1 year open label extension, I think we had about 40% of patients stayed in the study. That's not unusual for a 1 year study because in long studies, people are dropping out of the trial as much as they're dropping off the medication. But as well as that, they were sticking to the full dose by and large. We didn't have any measures to manage the diarrhea built into the study. Some of the investigators introduced them later on in the study, but they were never protocolized, they were never consistent. And one of the nice things about the label is that we got the basics of the common sense diarrhea management steps actually described in the label. So the label says that before starting trofinetide, you should discontinue all anti-constipation meds. You should consider adding fiber to the diet. If it persists, you can use an over-the-counter anti-diarrheal medication, and then if necessary, you can interrupt the therapy or discontinue the therapy. So that's all in the label, and I think it's safe to say qualitatively that what we've seen in the real world is a far lower rate of discontinuations due to diarrhea than we saw in the trials, without getting into specific numbers. We do track those. We get those reported to us from the family access managers who talk to the carers. So we know, and you can talk about this.
Yeah, we know who've discontinued. We've, one of the things which is helpful but also not abundantly clear is the one piece of data we get are refills, right?
Sure.
And so we can see who's refilled on time, but if a patient hasn't refilled on time, well, we don't necessarily know what the reason is, right? Are they titrating? Are they not taking the full dose? Are they taking a drug holiday? Or have they discontinued, or will they discontinued? So I think, a few months into the launch, especially as we're continuing to get lots of new patients and on therapy, it's too early to tell what that data is telling us. So I think it will be a number of months, if not quarters, before we can say, here's a true level of persistency that we can help and communicate to the market. But I just add on what Doug said, or maybe repeat what he said. We're certainly encouraged by what we've seen, to date in the real world versus what we saw kind of several months into the phase 3 and open label extension trials.
And I have to tell you, I really appreciate you joining and talking about that generally with regard to the timing in the quarter. So I appreciate the observation. So why don't we talk a little bit about the 2-year observational study called Lotus? Help us understand that, and then we'll talk about ex-US initiatives.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So randomized control trials are obviously a very artificial environment, as I was kind of alluding to earlier. So one of the things we wanted to do was, as soon as DAYBUE became available, was study it in a naturalistic setting, in a real-world setting. So Lotus is a 2-year real-world evidence study. Every patient prescribed DAYBUE gets the opportunity to participate. And we've structured so that it captures, it's a minimal burden for the carers, but it captures both carer-rated and prescriber-rated measures of outcomes, but also we'll collect data on the dose, the measures that they've used to manage any side effects that they're having, so diarrhea as an example, and persistence. And the way we've structured it, we encourage and hope that patients who discontinue DAYBUE will also stay in the study, which will give us some kind of patients that we can compare between the patients who stay on it. So again, it's going to give us, we'll be able to, it's all open label, of course, so we'll be able to cut the data as often as we like.
Sure.
And it'll give us over time a more realistic picture of how DAYBUE is being used and what the tolerability and benefit profile looks like in a real world setting.
You anticipate doing a data cut in the next 6-ish months? I mean, could there be some data flow out of Lotus by then?
Yeah, I think we're going to take a look at the data internally every 3 months.
Yeah.
So as soon as we see data that we think is meaningful and worth sharing, we'll certainly share it.
Okay. Why don't we have just 5 minutes left. So I want to talk about the pipeline, although I didn't hear an answer on ex-US initiatives with Trophy.
So I think briefly, we signed the deal in July to expand our rights worldwide.
Yeah.
So Canada was already part of our territory in North America, so we expect to launch in Canada within the next 18 months. But for the larger markets around the world that are part of the New Deal, we're at the stage of really first interacting with regulators to take scientific advice on how to move forward. So we think it's probably about a couple of year time period to get on the market in Europe. We don't believe we need to generate any additional clinical data, but we need to confirm that. For a market like Japan, the expectation is, as is typical with most pharmaceutical products, that we probably have to run some form of bridging study in Japanese patients. But we're very excited about the opportunity to serve Rett patients worldwide. I mean, when we launched in the US, we certainly got many calls from KOLs and caregivers seeking treatment. So there is high interest, there is awareness, but now we just need to pick up from where Neuren had left off and take this to markets outside the US.
But that could also allow you to become a global company and market ex-US.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think for us, we are today a US company, really due to the nature of the portfolio, and NUPLAZID is really a product that's valuable in the US, and while it can certainly treat patients ex-US, it's certainly challenging to get pricing when you'll be forced to reference to generics. Right. So that's challenging, and it's unfortunate for patients. So we're not limited to the US because of capabilities or ambitions, nor do we have, nor is like we're looking to build a global empire. We're certainly looking to, build a pharmaceutical company, invest in good science and deliver that to patients if we're successful in bringing them to market. And the capabilities of the people internally, many of us have worked at global companies and have experience getting products approved and commercialized ex-US. So we're fully have the ability to do that and make incremental investments in people and infrastructure to be successful outside the US. It's just the first opportunity for us to do that will be with trofinetide, maybe whatever we wind up calling it outside the US.
Excellent. So in the last couple of minutes, let's just touch on the pipeline. But are there any questions from the audience? Okay, Doug, why don't we give you a lot more airtime with regard to the pipeline? ADVANCE-2 is soon to read out. Fourth quarter is what was last guided, as far as I know. Tell us about ADVANCE-2 and pimavanserin and its potential to treat negative symptoms in schizophrenia. It seems like a tough part to me.
Yeah, so first of all, ADVANCE-2, we complete enrollment sometime in the fourth quarter, but high-level results quarter one next year. Yeah. So let's talk very briefly about negative symptoms, first of all, because there's a lot of confusion about negative symptoms. There always has been. So schizophrenia sufferers suffer from positive symptoms, negative symptoms.
Yep.
It's to bring you a little bit into the world of what we psychiatrists call descriptive psychopathology. Positive symptoms are things that you didn't have before that you have now. Negative symptoms are things that you had before that have been taken away. So positive symptoms is the psychosis, the delusions, the hallucinations. Negative symptoms is lack of motivation, lack of energy, inability to experience emotion, lack of energy. And in many ways, those are the most disabling parts over the long term of having schizophrenia. People suffer their acute episodes, but between times, a proportion of those patients suffer from progressively worsening negative symptoms that rob them of their ability to have a normal family life, a normal work life, a normal social life. And these are the people that you see living in their parents' basements or out on the street. You will see, if you use the PANSS during the acute phase, you will see an apparent improvement in negative symptoms on the subscale. Those are what we call secondary negative symptoms. It's kind of an artifact of improvements in positive symptoms. Mm-hmm. To study negative symptoms, you have to look at patients whose positive symptoms are controlled, and then they remain controlled over a longer period of time, like 6 months. That's exactly what we've done in the advanced studies, and the first one, as you mentioned, was positive. So there are around 700,000 patients in the US who suffer from predominantly negative symptoms. And I think it's the largest unmet need in schizophrenia. So we have one positive study. We took the learnings from that study and incorporated them into the second study in terms of using the highest dose, and also in terms of we're not including any US sites in ADVANCE-2 because and this has been known about for decades. The placebo response in schizophrenia studies in the US is much higher than in Europe, and so I wouldn't say we were by any means. I've done neuroscience research too long to be confident about the outcome of any study, but I'm optimistic that study will be a positive result.
Well, our fingers are crossed. That'll be an interesting potential label expansion for pimavanserin. Sure. And other than that, unfortunately, we're out of time because there's a lot more going on. 204, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll be looking forward to talking to you for maybe during Brain Week 2, which is during December. We'll host you and talk more about the pipeline. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the audience for your interest in Acadia.
And thank you.
Thank you.